Welcome to this second edition of our OU Historical Journal video interview series. My name is Raphael Folsom. I'm a assistant professor of history in the Latin American area at University of Oklahoma. And I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Sandy Holguin, who is the author of numerous publications, including Creating Spaniards, Culture and National Identity in Republican Spain, as well as two recent articles in the American Historical Review. Very interesting piece called National Spain Invites You, Battlefield Tourism During the Spanish Civil War, which came out in the 2005 edition of the American Historical Review. And more recently, How Did the Spanish Civil War End? ... Not so well. Excellent title, which came out in the AHR in 2015. I'm also delighted to introduce Sarah Miles, who's a senior history major at OU. She's had a distinguished career here, including, I guess, a couple publications in the OU Historical Journal, including the forthcoming paper, Southern Ladies' Rebellion, The Failure of Women's Suffrage in Mississippi, which is going to be published in the 2016 edition of the OU Historical Journal, issue number 5. She has been accepted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Hooray!
Yeah, so congratulations on that, as well as the publications. And she's going to be studying the Francophone world, which is a topic of great interest to me and Sandy and many people as well. So welcome.
Thanks.
I thought I would start off by asking Dr. Holguin if she could tell us a little bit about the class that this paper was written for, how it evolved over the course of the semester.
Well, the course is part of our capstone series in the history department, and it was a seminar called The History of Feminist Thought, which talks about European and North American feminist thought from the 18th century to the present. And I try to expose students to sort of the major canonical works of that period. Sometimes Dr. Lewis teaches it as well, so we alternate that. And in that class, I try very hard to talk to people so that they don't think of feminism as the F word, because especially where we live, there are a lot of people who are really suspicious of that term. And I think I get a whole bunch of students. Generally, I get students who are very interested, and then those who couldn't get into other seminars. And then they end up actually liking it. I've had sort of everybody across the political spectrum in the course, and I try very hard to make it an open kind of classroom and introduce them to these kinds of ideas. And by the time they get out of there, they think, it's not that big a deal.
Well, it was particularly interesting when you taught it because we had almost 50-50 men-women.
Yeah, which is rare.
Unusual, yeah. And so that produced a lot of really good discussion, I think.
Right, and I had people in the military, people who were religiously conservative, people who were atheists, all of sort of everything in the classroom, and they all got along really well.
Yeah.
Excellent. And could you talk a little bit about the research component of the course? Because I think a lot of people who haven't majored in history think of history classes as memorizing dates and facts and so forth. And the kind of the creative work of research is the core of what we do. And it's something that I think the capstone is really focused on. And if you could talk a little bit about introducing students to the research process, I think that could be really interesting for a lot of people.
Well, I mean, this is the third part in the series where we start off with a history sleuth, which is like introduction to historical methods. And then we do a colloquium of intensive writing course where they research and write a 10-page paper. And then by the time they get to the capstone, they have to do a 20 to 25-page research paper based in primary and secondary sources. I tell my students that I'm really bad at dates, and they know this most of the time. I know some of the basic ones, but really what I try to teach them is how to write well, how to think critically, how to look at sources, how to be suspicious of them, and really how to be good historians in that way. They're not going to remember half the things half the dates, half the things that happen, but they will remember how to do the process, how to think critically, how to look at a whole bunch of evidence, synthesize it, decide what's good evidence, what's bad evidence, and those things are skills that you take outside of college. I think they're really good skills.
Definitely. And this was not your first research experience, I take it, but
No.
perhaps maybe the first research experience on this scale that you'd had before. Is that an accurate statement? Or
yeah, it's probably maybe tied with the longest I'd ever written, but was certainly out of the realm of things I knew about. So I did my honors research with Dr. Holguin over nationalism in Quebec and in Texas because I sort of knew those areas and have written other papers on modern history in Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
But early American history was by no means something I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was not only a longer paper, but a longer paper on a subject I wasn't necessarily familiar with. So it was a challenge.
Yeah, sounds like a quite a heavy lift, but a successfully executed heavy lift. So
Thanks.
congratulations on that. But I was curious about the topic of this paper, women's suffrage in Mississippi. When I think Mississippi, I generally don't think women's suffrage. When I think women's suffrage, I generally don't think Mississippi. And I wonder how you lit on this topic.
Reasonable lack of association. So we were starting to do early American feminism, so the Seneca Falls Conference and then those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I was noticing that there were almost no Southern women represented in these conferences. I thought that was really odd. So I decided I wanted to write my paper on pre-Civil War suffragism in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And then I discovered that there weren't any. Like, there was just nothing. They didn't exist. There was the Grimke sisters who were at the Seneca Falls Convention, but they left the South when they were like 15 or 16 and never came back.
Mm-hmm.
So there really wasn't any movement prior to the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So then I had to figure out how to change that to make it actually a paper.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, of course.
I know nothing about early American history either, so I had to, this is the thing, is I'm doing more theoretical kind of thing, and so I had to ask colleagues, current colleagues in our department, and some who have left our department for help on this.
Right.
So they were really quite helpful in getting
Yeah,
me
they
the
were.
information to give to Sarah.
Yeah, and they gave me a lot of good, like, basic sources. Okay, you need to read Fox Genovese in order to understand how all of this works.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really helpful. And then it was a good collaboration of various scholars, which was really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I decided to do after the Civil War because that's where people existed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Suffragists.
yeah, people were there before us. And basically every southern state had been researched and published on suffragism in every southern state. So Texas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, all those things had been covered, the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi hadn't been.
Mm.
And I found that really interesting. And I think the primary reason it hadn't been is that it did fail in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi actually didn't ratify the 20th Amendment until 1984, I believe. Like, they not only didn't pass it in 1920 when the federal government passed it, but they specifically rejected it in 1920 and didn't officially ratify it until 1984.
Wow.
And so I thought the lack of success in that was a really interesting way.
Just a little bit of specification. Were women not allowed to vote until 1984 in Mississippi?
No, they were allowed to vote, actually not in the first elections after 1920. They prevented them from voting in the first couple of elections. And then obviously kind of got to the point where the federal government encouraged Mississippi to let them do that. So they could officially vote, and obviously the federal law trumps the state law. So they could vote for that period, but they didn't officially ratify the 20th Amendment until then.
All right, so I've got a number of questions about this.
Sure.
So the whole question of women's voting is connected in interesting ways to the questions of African-American voting, which is enormously controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And could you talk a little bit about the ways in which those two movements and conflicts were connected or disconnected from one another?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the North, we have this sort of stereotypical association in the U.S. Suffrage movements of abolitionism and women's suffrage, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the South, it was primarily the opposite. So white women would advocate for their right to vote, saying African Americans now have the right to vote. If you want to counter that, like, we can make a bigger block if you let us join you, which is highly problematic in a variety of ways. Yeah. And originally I had thought that in Mississippi, there really wasn't that discriminatory tendency.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really interesting. And Dr. Holguin asked me, we had turned in rough drafts of the paper, and I had said, they were really not racist, and that was really great. And she asked me to talk a little bit more about the race component, and the more I looked into it, the more I found that eventually they did start espousing those racist, values.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to figure out what changed to make that happen. So basically what I found was that the first president of the Mississippi Women's Suffrage Association, Nellie Nugent Somerville is her name, was impressively progressive for her time, was very anti-racist, maybe a little patronizing, a little condescending, as things might have been in that period, but largely against trying to use African-American votes in order to help themselves. So eventually she stepped down from the presidency around 1900, and the subsequent presidents of the organization started using that rhetoric. But the first 5 or 10 years of the organization really didn't use that sort of anti-African American rhetoric at all, which was really interesting.
Interesting, and you can start to surmise some reasons why this history wasn't written before. I mean, the notion of women's suffragism as an explicitly racist movement is not a pretty picture in some
it's
respects.
not popular, really.
It's a very ambiguous picture. That's related to another question I wanted to ask you guys, and one of the things that I think a lot of students say when they come into history classes in college is history is written by the winners. And in your case, it's a kind of a much more ambiguous circumstance. And I wonder, why it's important to write about failed movements. Because we published another essay a couple of years ago dealing with a failed movement. I don't remember the nature of it, but it was interesting that that was the focus. And I think it is important, but when I try and kind of brainstorm as to, why it's important to write about the history of failed movements, I kind of draw a little bit of a blank. And could you help me understand that?
You have ideas on it? Well, you went first, famously.
Yeah, that was a professor move. What do you think?
I've done it many a time.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, you can look at it in lots of different ways. One is the notion of dissent is really important, that it's good to mark moments of dissent, even if they lost, just to know that those kinds of people are out there, and to realize that there are many points of view that aren't discussed at all. And sometimes things that are failed movements are really, they fail on a contingent basis. It's not necessarily that they were destined to fail. It's that you can then begin to see what else was operating in a particular kind of system to see why something has failed.
And I think even if they don't achieve a very grand, successful thing, failed movements are still very informative on people's identities, on how people are going to operate, what is conceived of as possible or not possible in that area. And so it affects deeply, I think, the subsequent history of wherever you're looking, whoever you're looking at.
I think that's kind of a profound and eloquent statement of our answer to my question. I'm curious, is this something you want to continue with when you go to graduate school, or things related to this, or are there things from this experience that you'll take into your next research experience that you can tell us about? Yeah,
so feminist history is something I'm really interested in, and so I'll probably take some of the broader themes from Dr. Holguin's class into my future research. In terms of antebellum Mississippi history, probably not. I thought it was really interesting. I liked challenging myself and trying to research something that wasn't what I knew, but it's not really something I think I want to continue. But certainly the practices and trying to figure out, okay, well, I thought this was the case about this organization, but it turns out that's really not what's happening. So let me try to revise my process, figure out what else is going on here. How can I amend what I thought originally to make it make more sense with the evidence I'm looking at? That's obviously a really valuable thing to be able to do.
Oh, and hugely important for students or prospective majors to know about, in the sense that very often you read a history book and it's this wonderfully kind of finished product, and when you look inside the process of creating such a thing, there's a tremendous amount of evolution that goes on, and you realize, oh my gosh, everything I thought was wrong, or my research was ill-conceived and I've got to look at something else, and there's no, as you said, no data on something I was originally interested in. That's part of the one of the tough things about history, but also one of the beautiful things. It's something that's an ongoing process. Can you talk a little bit to our prospective majors and about what you got out of the history major, why you majored in it, why it's a good major for people to think about?
Yeah, so I always wanted to be a history major. I've always wanted to be a historian. I was 5 years old telling people I was going to be a historian. So I came in knowing I wanted to do it. I did it. I've loved it. And I know that that's not usually the case.
No.
It's not really the common childhood dream. But I think the ability to synthesize information, to look critically at evidence and data, in some cases if you're doing that sort of history, and people's ideas and draw conclusions from that is highly valuable. And I've done research with poli-sci professors, I've done research with a medical professor, and just the ability to go find information and figure out what it's telling you is something that the history major teaches you to do that I think you don't find as much in other majors. That even if you don't want to do anything with history in your life, the ability to, as I say, think critically about the information presented to you is something that's going to be really valuable regardless of what you do.
I think that's absolutely correct. And another conception that some people may have is there's this notion of the professor as the sage on the stage, and that's a very worthy. It's a worthy model, and I think there's certain lectures that I have really stuck with me throughout my career as a historian. I think back on seeing a lecture by Jonathan Spence that was enormously inspiring to me. He's a historian of China. And I knew I didn't know Chinese, but
Right.
and I would never be able to do that. But I did want to be able to kind of explore history in the way that he did. I think that's not the only good model of history teaching that there is, and I don't want to speak for Sandy on this score, but I would imagine that as you teach this class, you learn a lot from the students, and your point of view on the subject matter changes. I had no idea about this before
Right.
Sarah taught me about it, and if you could just talk a little bit about how your understanding of history has evolved through the teaching of this class, I think that'd be really interesting.
Well, I haven't thought about it in quite those terms. I mean, I always learn something from students' papers because they often do subjects that I have no idea about, because I have students that come in and they're sort of majoring in, or they're concentrating on Japanese history or some other kind of history. Those who do Europe, I'm like,
Right.
I don't learn that much more, but at this point. But other people I do, and I try very hard to decenter myself as the professor and let them lead discussions whenever possible and just interject when I can, because I think they need the practice in figuring out how to talk about these things. I think they're, the works, I've read the works many times,
Right.
and so I'm bored with hearing my interpretation of them. So I want to hear what they have to say to it. And it's a great thrill as a professor to see somebody come to the material for the first time and get really excited about it and talk about it. And so I spend a lot of time having them talk in class amongst themselves. And then, once in a while I'll throw out questions, but I do let the students lead the discussion. I tend to have them assign a student or two each week to lead the discussion, come up with the questions. And so in that sense, I learn from them. And I also learned what works and doesn't work in the classroom. And sometimes it's just the chemistry of the classroom, and sometimes it's something I've done wrong. So.
Yes, indeed. I have that experience often. How did this model work for you as a student? Did you like the way that she taught the class and this kind of discussion-based?
Putting her on the spot here.
Oh, sorry about
No,
that.
it was honestly really great. And I think that's ideal for a capstone where you have people who are very committed to the major and to the topic, and want to be there and want to work on this. And we had a really phenomenal class. We all got along really well. We had, as she said, somebody in the military, other people who were radical anarchists, and so really wide variety of political opinions and social experience. And that really let us talk. The anarchists loved Emma Goldman when we talked about her, and that was really exciting.
The anarchist former sorority.
Yeah, she was great. We liked her. Or when we talked about, Simone de Beauvoir, the person who's in the military, was like, I'd never thought of it this way, and I'd never really, considered that women could have this experience or that experience or whatever. And so it let us say, oh, well, I've experienced this in this way, or I've read this other thing, and really connect with the text and connect with our own experience, and therefore work with it in a way that just listening and sitting to a lecture, despite the fact that I know your lectures are good, it wouldn't really let you do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have learned an enormous amount from my students, and I think it's always completely fascinating to hear what students have to say, because they come up with things that you never would have thought of. And some of the things are, kind of off topic and, not entirely germane to discussion, but other times they're incredibly compelling because there's such a variety of experience represented in our student body.
Yeah.
Are there topics you guys want to discuss that we haven't discussed yet, or things that you felt can happen in this course that our viewers need to know about?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think one of the most salient things that I took from this particular paper was how much I had to scrap ideas and come back to them and work with it a different way. And a lot of the times for other classes, especially if they're on history classes, I'll be like, okay, I want to write about de Gaulle, and then I go find information about de Gaulle, and then I write about de Gaulle, and that's fine. But this was a paper that was particularly challenging, A, because I didn't have the information to start with. This wasn't something I knew about, and because there were so many times where I was like, okay, this is not what I thought was happening here. How do I fix it? How do I interpret this? And I think that's something that was really valuable and can be really important to keep in mind when you're doing research, is it's not always going to turn out how you thought it was going to turn out. And you have to be willing to change things around and edit papers and throw parts out and whatever.
And I think that's the part that a lot of students find difficult to do. And I think we do as well, is once you've written those pearls of wisdom, you don't want to cut them or change them around. And especially when the papers due at the end of the semester, they don't want to rewrite it.
Right.
So one of the things we try to tell them in the earlier classes is you need to write and rewrite and edit. And we tell them, and it's kind of goes in there. And most of the time, just flies out. But we do get people like Sarah and others who do take the comments seriously on the rough drafts and work with it. And students hate me and love me for this. I have the rough drafts due about a month before the final draft is due. So they're working their butts off about a month before, and they're going a little nuts. And then I read the things and comment very profusely on the papers. And then they've got now a month or 3 weeks to really rework it. And so those who choose to take me up on it do a really good job. And those who don't, well, it's
life's complicated. Yeah. I think one thing I would add to this is that this experience you had of being confused a lot of the time, having to scrap many things, not understanding where you are, I think that will persist for the rest of your life.
Yes.
And, we recently had a very distinguished guest, a historian named James Brooks, who focuses mostly on the history of Native peoples. And we kind of agreed, if you're not confused most of the time when you're writing about Native peoples, you're doing it wrong. And I think that, learning how to kind of, live with and work with your own confusion and sort of feelings of being at sea is part of what we do. And I think the satisfactions of doing that when you come out with a paper like this one are incredibly, salient and memorable. So. With that, I think we'll conclude this interview. Many thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations once again.
Thank you.
Good luck at UNC.
Thanks.